In early 1975, James recorded Everybody's Doing the Hustle and Dead on the Double Bump. That's one album. This album is far from one of JB's most critically acclaimed, but I find it a great listen, if perhaps a little incongruous. It's pretty easy to tell that it's compiled from a few very different sounding recording ventures. This album's cover was one of the last to contain any musician credits until Bring It On in 1983. And hidden among the list of JB mainstays are two telltale session guys, Leon Pendarvis on clavinet and Joe Beck on guitar, who first popped up alongside Sam Brown on 1971's Get on the Good Foot, where they did this. Joe Beck contributed his flavour of flawless funk to tracks from 1972's There It Is, 74's Hell and Reality, which contained this gem again alongside Sam Brown. The back cover of Everybody's Doing the Hustle also tells us that it was recorded in June-July 1975 in New York City. However, a bit of detective work reveals that at least one track was actually recorded back on March 18 of that year. I learned this from a couple of conversations with James's former production supervisor, Bob Both, who was extremely generous and patient with my endless guitar nerd questions. Thanks, Bob. And I reckon two more tracks, new versions of Papa's Got a Brand New Bag and Kansas City, were similarly recorded at different sessions to the album's four remaining cuts. Whilst the other songs are cleaner recordings with clearly evident overdubs and overall heavier production. Also, the guitar tones and playing on Hustle, Your Love, Superbad, Superslick and Calm and Cool all exhibit that unmistakable session musician flawlessness. However, there are clearly two guitarists on three of those performances, and a little more digging turned up another new name. The liner notes on the singles Volume 10 reveal that studio whiz Joe Beck was joined by another session legend, John Tropea, on this album's reboot of Superbad called Superbad, Superslick. John Tropea was born in New York City on January 7, 1946. He started playing guitar at age 12 and went to Berkeley to become awesome. As you do. He has released a dozen solo albums and played with many huge names throughout an impressive session career during the 70s and 80s. He played on albums by Van Morrison, Roberta Flack, Donny Hathaway, Dionne Warwick, Chaka Khan. But not only smooth FM hits, he's contributed to albums by Billy Cobham, Bo Diddley, John Mayall, Alice Cooper, Peter Criss. Amazing. He's even graced albums by those legends that need but one name. Ringo, Yoko, Liza, Streisand, Clapton. He first came to my attention playing on these awesome Harry Chapin albums. Greatest Stories Live, Portrait Gallery, Verities and Boulder Dash. Yeah, you've heard him here. And here. Problem is all inside your head. So, getting back to Everybody's Doing the Hustle, my conclusion is that Mr. Brown's funkiest guitar duo Jimmy Chank Nolen and Herlin Cheese Martin are playing on those three grittier cuts. In fact, James name checks the two of them on the album's closer, Kansas City.
Jimmy Nolen on guitar. Of course, we got Cheese from North Carolina.
It also sounds like either Chank or Cheese playing that perpetually repetitive two-note riff on Your Love. Session gurus would never be content playing those two notes for 4 minutes straight. The remainder of the album's guitars are contributed by session magicians Joe Beck and John Tropea. Listen to Calm and Cool. It's not a brilliant song and it's certainly not all that funky, but Tropea's phased guitar in the left speaker exhibits some magical off-the-cuff improvisation all the way through the track. I mean, I'm guessing that's John Tropea, based on the fact that it sounds very reminiscent of the stuff that I grew up hearing him play on those Chapin albums. A perfect example of this dichotomy between James's guys and the studio wizards is the differing grooves on the new versions of Papa's Got a Brand New Bag and Superbad, Superslick. Both contain great new riffs, superbly performed, but Papa just sounds so much funkier. It's nastier, it's irresistible. If I was going to get all analytical about it, I'd say the differences are: 1, that unmistakable tone from Jimmy Nolen's guitar. He was playing his Black Widow here with those super heavy strings that he never changed. A studio musician generally plays an instrument that's far more widely accepted as a standard, such as a Strat, a Tele, a 335, something that sits more unobtrusively in the mix. 2, his picking technique, those ghost notes, those muted string clicks. That are every bit as much a part of his riffs as the notes themselves. The perfectly clean execution on Superbad exhibits none of that. And 3, Cheese's pocket. This guy is my favourite rhythm guitarist ever. He grooves endlessly on some ninth chord vamp, and it's just always flawless. You could take any one bar of his performances, like live or studio, and loop it and use it as a metronome. You know, watching through the April 71 live performance in Bologna, Italy, he just stands there and lays it down. From start to finish, while Catfish Collins is riffing and soloing and boogieing with his brother, Cheese's groove is simply hypnotic. The thing is where he sits with reference to the drums, with reference to Catfish, Bootsy, Nolen, Fred Thomas, everyone else. It just feels so perfectly funky to me, and it never wavers. Let's take a moment to get forensic about what I'm frothing over here. Here's a 4-bar section from Hot Pants. John Jabbo Starks is laying down a strict downbeat, kick on 1 and 3, kick and snare on 2 and 4. Now Jabbo almost always plays his snare a fraction of a second late. That's his pocket, and the lateness depends on how drivey he wants the song to feel. On Hot Pants, his snare is almost imperceptibly behind the beat. Cheese takes this opportunity to hang back ever so slightly. And Fred Thomas is right there with him. On Greedy Man, Jabbo is again right on the beat. And again, Cheese, who is just playing on the 2 and the 4, along with the snare drum, is in his pocket just behind the beat, consistently. Check out the bridge section of the 75 remake of I Feel Good. In this example, Cheese really pushes those 16th note chord stabs, playing almost a 64th note ahead of the groove. Different pocket for a different feel, but still metronomically consistent. The payback. This is a great example. Cheese is so consistently behind the beat here, plus he plays like the tiniest hint of shuffle. It's insanely good. Listen to it isolated. While we're nerding out, let's put Phelps' Catfish Collins under the microscope. I just happen to have here the great man's isolated guitar track from his very first recording with James Brown and the JBs. Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine, recorded in Nashville on April 25, 1970. Firstly, note here that Jabbo's snare hits are more noticeably after the beat. And we can see that Catfish is pretty well locked right in with Jabbo's beat, including those late snare hits. 1 and 2 and, but then feels that sustained 13th chord on the 3 just after the beat. And then the upbeat 16th note stab, which is counted on the of beat 3. 1 and 2 and he plays quite late, revealing the swung 16ths behind this groove. However, if we compare this to little brother Bootsy's bass playing on the track, we can see that he plays it all straight, not swung at all. So we've got the drummer laying his snare ever so slightly behind the beat, the guitarist following him closely, except for that 13th note chord on beat 3, which is further behind the beat. Then the bass is right on the beat, but driving the whole shebang with a straight 16th note feel. And that's why every lineup sounds different, and that is where the magic is. Thanks for indulging me. Now, before we move on to James's next release, Sex Machine Today, we just need to quickly pop back to Slaughter's big rip-off from 1973, because I only just discovered that this album features a couple of appearances by an absolute legend of soul guitar. The incomparable David T. Walker plays on the Slaughter theme and People Get Up and Drive Your Funky Soul, according to the album credits for the singles, volumes 8 and 9. On the album's opener, we can hear David in the left speaker. I imagine it's Cheese on the right. But check out the bridge section at 2 minutes 28, around 2 minutes 28. This is classic David T. Walker. Those pretty little flurries of hammer-ons and pull-offs are an absolute signature of his beautiful playing. He is solely responsible for so much of what we now neo-soul or gospel guitar. David Tyrone Walker was born on June 25th, 1941 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He began teaching himself guitar at age 16 and soon gained experience working in juke joints and blues clubs. While in high school, he formed a group called the Kinfolks, who went on to travel the entire USA many times, playing the Chitlin circuits for 7 years. The Kinfolks were signed to Motown Records, and at age 28, David T. signed his own recording contract and released the first of 15 solo albums. His impossibly pretty sound soon became sought after, and consequently his 1950s Gibson Birdland has appeared on more than 2,500 albums by hundreds and hundreds of artists, such as the Jackson 5, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson, Aretha Franklin, The Temptations, Diana Ross, Four Tops, Little Richard, Ray Charles,
Cannonball Adderley, Herbie Hancock, Jimmy Smith, The Crusaders, Quincy Jones, Carole King, Sergio Mendes, Boz Scaggs, Billy Preston, Bobby Womack,
Lou Rawls, Solomon Burke, Sammy Davis Jr., Barry White, Bill Withers, the Isley Brothers, Mamas and Papas, Barbra Streisand, Gladys Knight, Sarah Vaughan.
and the extraordinary list goes on and on and on. But here are a couple of great examples that might sound familiar.
Baby, let's cruise away from here.
Never can say goodbye.
David T. came to my attention through his recent work with the wonderful Wolf Peck, and particularly Jack Stratton's guitar episode of his Holy Trinity series. Link in the description. Don't go and watch it now. Stay here. Just check it out later. Okay, back to 1975 and James's second release for the year, Sex Machine Today. And although I can only find credits for 3 of the 6 tracks, we have at least one new appearance on guitar, Cornell Dupree, who is credited with playing alongside Joe Beck on Problems, which is a pretty nothing track from a guitar perspective, or any perspective really. Cornell Dupree, born December 19, 1942 in Fort Worth, Texas. He's another studio legend with over 2,500 sessions to his name. Back in his early days, he played with some huge artists, Aretha, Miles, Lena, Gabor. He recorded a dozen albums of his own and was in a number of Steve Gadd's bands. Then later, he's on Guilty by Streisand, he's on Donny Hathaway's albums, he appeared on There Goes Rhymin' Simon, appeared on Delbert McClinton's You Never Been Rocked Enough. I love this album. Appeared on Chukka's debut release. In researching Cornell's massive career, I also happened to discover that Sex Machine Today wasn't his first JB rodeo. He actually contributed to at least a couple of tracks on 1974's Reality, the title track upon which Cornell and Joe Beck face off in left and right speakers, and further on up the road, a boogie featuring 3 distinct guitar parts. Back to Sex Machine Today. The other 2 tracks for which I can find credits are Dead On It and a reinvented I Feel Good, both cuts featuring our men Chank and Cheese. So again, I'm left guessing who's playing on everything else here, but here's what I'm hearing. Sex Machine sounds like studio guys, probably Cornell doing the scratch rhythm on his bridge pickup with a phaser, while Joe Beck plays a Nolan-esque single note line. Played nothing like Nolan. Again, there's no notable muted string clicks, and the longer notes feature vibrato, something that Jimmy never did. I Got You, I Feel Good, Jimmy and Cheese. This reinvention that no one asked for features some interesting guitar play, and I just happen to have the isolated stem. So this phrase here, we can hear both Jimmy and Cheese. Jimmy's playing the single note lines, and Cheese Martin is playing these chords. Now, with these three notes here, this is what I'm interested in. Cheese always plays his chord slightly ahead of where Jimmy plays his note. We can see this peak transient here. That's Jimmy Nolen's single note coming in just a fraction of a second later after Cheese strums the chord. Then we go to the third note of the phrase, and it's the other way around. We can see that transient is right at the start, and if you listen, you can hear it. It takes a few listens to get used to it. Yeah, there we go. Cheese hits the first note earlier than Nolen, but then the reverse happens for the third note every time. I think this is why these two were so hugely successful in generating so much of the world's twin guitar grooves. Each possessed an entirely different pocket from the other. Dead on it, this performance is clearly James's usual band. In fact, he name checks Charles Sherrill and Jimmy Nolen on it. This 13-minute jam isn't that interesting, but it does feature a couple of great Chank and Cheese dual guitar riffs. Get Up Off of Me, session band again, pretty cool blues riff. Deep in It, session guys again. This is an interesting listen. Definitely not the usual band. 3 guitars, a heavily fuzzed out main riff, and lots of tasty lead played through a phaser in the left speaker, along with a great wah part on the right, which I'm guessing is Joe Beck or possibly even Sam Brown, as it's very reminiscent of what we heard on Funky Side of Town from Get on the Good Foot. Next we have Body Heat, released in 1976. Production supervisor Bob Both explained that, like the last few albums, it was a collection of miscellaneous unreleased tracks coupled with 3 new recordings done with the stripped down JBs. I'm guessing the stripped down JBs featured a lone Jimmy Nolen on guitar, as heard on these 3 very JBs sounding grooves. The title track, which contains some trademark Nolen scratching on one guitar. Kiss in 77, which is a pretty dull track, but kind of interesting only because we rarely hear Jimmy Nolen play major 7th chords. And check out how far behind the beat he's sitting on this one. And finally, I'm Satisfied, one of the album's funkier cuts, another novel Jimmy Nolen riff. Great bass line too, probably Charles Sherrill. I think the high point on this album from a guitar standpoint is Don't Tell It, which was recorded back in 73. But I love the dual guitars, Chank Nolen and Cheese Martin once again. In this case, Nolen is playing a simple scratchy chord motif while Cheese plays improvised octaves. Unusual to hear Cheese Martin improvising, as opposed to relentlessly churning out a chordal groove. And I reckon some of those lines may have inspired some later hits. The only other guitarist I could turn up in my research for Body Heat was studio legend Hugh McCracken, who plays on this album's remake of Woman. This Nothing track was recorded back in 72 during the sessions that would result in Get on the Good Foot. We met Hugh back in chapter 2, where we learned that he played on everything from this to this. Body Heat was followed by Get Up Off of That Thing. Now, if you want to hear some funk guitars, this is a strong album. Jimmy Nolen, front and centre. It begins with Chank playing a wonderful, subtly evolving rhythm part on the title track. He rarely repeats a phrase without some tiny alteration, so that it gradually works its way into becoming an entirely different riff. A very different performance for Jimmy Nolen. Jimmy was rejoined on this track by Robert Lee Coleman, who contributed to Hot Pants back in 71, although his guitar is horribly out of tune on this one, when it comes in at about 109.
Get up off of that thing and shake the youth, feel better. Get up off
It's a great part, fitting beautifully amongst the various elements in this excellent track, but it's just a bit too sharp to be overlooked. Charles Sherrill, in a Wax Poetics interview, claimed that he and Jimmy Nolen actually wrote Get Up Off of that thing. I can't tell you who's playing the wah guitar on track 2, You Took My Heart. Sounds like a very polished session guy, but I'd wager it's Jimmy Nolen playing the lead part on the intro. Refuse to Lose is a sensational funk outing, featuring, I think, Jimmy Nolen on the right, playing a single note figure, and Cheese Martin on the left strumming out the chicken scratching rhythm. Although the liner notes from the singles volume 10 say it's Robert Coleman with Jimmy Nolen, but it doesn't sound like Coleman at all to me. Except for the fact that that B string's so sharp on that segue lick. It's probably just Jimmy's worn out strings. The next track, Can't Take It With You, is another ripper. This time we have only Nolen on guitar. Check out this sensational staccato riff. Jimmy even plays some rare and nasty lead on this number. Home Again is a slow blues where Robert Lee Coleman again joins Chank. But the album's closer, This Feeling, features some absolutely brilliant wah action in the left speaker, and the interplay with the chicken scratching on the right is a joyous listen. I don't think either guitar part is played by James's usual slingers. Both continually morph without repeating a standard motif like JB usually preferred his guitarists to do. And even though we heard Jimmy Nolen do that on the title track, it was really subtle compared to this, where both parts are littered regularly with some slick improvisation. Now, I've done loads and loads of detective work and I can't find anything out about the session that yielded this song, but it is a great listen and super funky. Big question mark, does anybody know? We're still in 1976 and James is releasing his third long player for the year. Hot. This may just provide a most incredible confluence in our journey. Did John Lennon and David Bowie play on a James Brown song? Yeah! For the uninitiated, the title track of this album sounds kind of like, well, it sounds very like, it sounds exactly like David Bowie's 1976 smash hit, Fame. David Bowie's Fame was recorded first in New York in January 75 and released in March. James's track, Hot, I Need to Be Loved, 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 is also said to have been recorded in New York in late 1975 and released in December. The story goes, John Lennon is in the studio with Bowie to collaborate on a cover of his gorgeous Across the Universe.
Words are flowing out like endless.
John Lennon came to the sessions that I was working on in America. What happened really, Carlos Alomar, my rhythm guitarist, had a riff that I'd been using for foot stomping.
Everybody young and old knows how to rock and roll.
And we sort of said, let's take that riff and then write something over it.
Right.
It was Carlos's riff. And then John was playing and it kept on coming up. This is John Lennon saying aim. And I put an F in front of it and that was it really.
This was all captured on tape. The wonderful guitarist Carlos Alomar then added his wicked funk lines. And Bowie threw his own distorted riff on top. The burning question here is, did James simply sing over Bowie's backing tracks? Or did he have his guys recreate the whole thing? This question has suffered much intense debate on many internet forums. And the answer is, Brown's band replayed the parts. I know this because the intro is completely different. The mix is very different. For example, Bowie's riff is mixed centrally on the original, but hard right in James's recording. The guitar tones are different. Lennon's acoustic guitar is completely missing, as is one of Carlos's funk parts. The bass line changes. The more you listen, the more obvious it becomes that it is an entirely different recording. However, Bowie and Carlos Alomar both indirectly composed guitar parts for James Brown. So who did play guitar on this and on the rest of the album? The liner notes from James Brown, The Singles Volume 10, tell us the session featured studio legends Joe Beck and John Tropea, but also mention a new name that I'd never heard before, Duncan Cleary. Who is Duncan Cleary? Well, this is a story about being in the right place at the right time. Back in the early 70s, a 19-year-old kid named Bob Both scored a job at Polydor Records. As the new kid in the building, Polydor set Bob up in the very last office all the way down the hall, right next to James Brown Productions. Part of Bob's job was to facilitate getting mixed albums through mastering and prepared for release. Now, due to his close proximity, James Brown would just pop right on in and drop his latest mix on Bob's desk. But after not too long, James started dumping unmixed multi-track recordings on Bob's desk and saying, "Go mix it." So Bob learned how to mix. And gradually this grew into full production responsibilities, organising recording sessions, working with James as MDs. He became known as Mr. Brown's engineer and production supervisor. Basically, Bob went on to produce most of James Brown's early to mid-70s albums, from Get on the Good Foot through to Hot. Now, Bob also played in several bands in the early 70s with a very good friend of his on guitar. And when Bob built his studio, Twain Recording, in his West Milford home, his guitar player Bud lived there for a time. In early 75, Bob was working closely with Fred Wesley on production of the JB's album Hustle and Speed, and one day Bob introduced Fred to his guitar slinging pal. On April 28, 1975, Bob recorded the JB's track Here We Come, Here We Go, Here We Are at Wally Hyder's recording studio in San Francisco. Then on June 25 at Sound Ideas Studio C, New York City, he had his mate Duncan play a solo over the intro. Duncan Cleary was born September 5th, 1953, and although I couldn't find much info about his early life, I did discover that in his teens, Duncan used to cut school and hang out at Manny's, drooling over the guitars. One morning we got there right as the store opened, and as we walked towards the back of the store, there stood Jimi Hendrix. It was obvious he was still going strong from the night before. If memory serves me, he was trying out a 335, strung right-handed. He was playing it upside down like Albert Collins. He sounded unreal. Duncan Cleary continued to play and teach guitar throughout his life, even sharing the stage with the amazing Robin Ford. Man, I don't know what Duncan thinks he's doing that high up the neck with Robin Ford looking over his shoulder. I'd be strumming first position chords with my volume turned all the way down. That's gutsy. Bob Both, who was extremely generous with information for this chapter, clarified that Duncan did not in fact play on the Bowie pilfering title track of Hot, contrary to the album liner notes. But in September 75, Duncan sat in on a session at A&R Recording Studios, New York, where he played second guitar on 3 tracks that would end up on Hot. For Sentimental Reasons, So Long, and Try Me. Bob said that Duncan was pretty in awe of playing with Joe Beck, Will Lee and Steve Gadd. Duncan Cleary also ended up playing on stage with James Brown for a period. I'm not sure when or where, but I found a Facebook post where he regaled an audience with a tale of being fined numerous times by Mr. Brown. Sadly, Duncan passed away a couple of years back. So back to the Bowie borrowing track Hot, I Need to Be Loved, 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 Loved. In researching this song, I found a couple of references to Bowie's guitarist Carlos Alomar's earlier contributions to James Brown's music during the late 60s. Wait, what? Carlos Alomar was in James's band in the 60s? And I didn't put it in chapter 1? This is from Carlos's website. At 17, he became the youngest guitarist in the history of the Apollo Theatre, walking on stage and winning over a dubious crowd with solo versions of Motown hits by the Supremes and Junior Walker. Alomar became a guitarist in the Apollo's house band and performed with James Brown. I wonder if any recordings of these shows exist. Carlos is mainly known as one of Bowie's guitarists throughout the 70s and early 80s, and was most recently heard on Mark Ronson's Uptown Special. In 1977, James recorded and released Mother's Nature, which I think is a much better album than Hot. The first half a dozen tracks are all very funky and sound like James's guys. Either that or the New Yorkers are getting the hang of groove without being too smooth. But I don't think so. While most of the tracks appear to feature only a single guitar part, recognisable as Jimmy Nolen, I particularly enjoy the dual guitar parts on People Who Criticise. And while it's hard to say who that second guitarist is, because there is simply zero record keeping or album credits or literature from this era, I'm confident it's not Cheese Martin. Because the strumming, while still very funky, it just doesn't exhibit that absolute perfection of Cheese Martin's pocket. The liner notes for the Duets compilation, released in 1989, claim that Ron Laster played second guitar on the version of Summertime that originally appeared on Mother's Nature. However, Ron himself claims not to have joined James's band until 2 years later, in 1979, so it's not him. All the live footage I can find from 77 shows is just Jimmy on stage by himself, usually with two bass players, but no second guitarist. Although, I did find a fantastic 1977 concert, Stars Ballroom in Boston, 18th December. Jimmy is name-checked after contributing a great solo in the intro piece. The guitar is wonderfully clear throughout the recording. In fact, you should do yourself a favour and go and listen to this in its entirety. I'll put the link down in the description. Don't go and listen to it now. Stay with me. We're nearly there. It's just an incredible record of Jimmy Nolen's relentless and flawless driving funk. He's covering both the single line parts and interspersing it with the chord stabs and the scratching. He does not miss a beat for over an hour and a quarter. It is incredible. In particular, his Sex Machine scratching is insanely perfect. And his Cold Sweat, his one-man Cold Sweat. Anyway, back to the mystery of the second guitarist playing alongside Jimmy on Mother's Nature. My only other guess is that it may be the first recorded appearance of Keith Gregory. Only because Keith popped up on 1978's Jam 1980s album, at least some of which was recorded in 77. Keith Gregory. Born in Little Rock, Arkansas, Keith's family moved to Anchorage, Alaska, where he began his musical career playing drums in local bands. After switching to guitar, Keith played around the world not only with James Brown but also with the Drifters and the Platters. Keith then went solo and continues to record and release his music to this day. Jam 1980s features Keith alongside Jimmy Nolen on all 5 tracks, if liner notes on Discogs are to be believed. Shit songwriting, but quite a good album to hear some classic dual funk guitar parts over some hypnotic grooves. The Spank exhibits some pretty cool dual guitar single note riff interplay. And I love the main figure from Nature. Also released in 78 was the cringingly titled Take a Look at Those Cakes. The songwriting here is even more shit than Jam 1980s. Honestly, we'd be no worse off if these 5 tracks had stayed in the can. At least in this instance, the whole album is clearly recorded by the same lineup. Tony Cook, Johnny Griggs, Jerry Poindexter, David Weston on some very prominently affected bass parts, Pink, Joe Poff and Holly Farris, and of course Jimmy Nolen on guitar. The only track of any interest is, unfortunately, the title track. Apparently the supreme wit of referring to bum cheeks as cakes warrants an 11-minute dissertation. The only reason I find it interesting is because we can hear 2 guitars on this drivel, and I believe this to be the very first example of a Jimmy Nolen overdub.
Wait a minute! Is that Jimmy? Boogie, 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 boogie.
Although I don't actually think Jimmy played that second part over the first. I think maybe the producer took what Jimmy was playing for the B section and overdubbed it onto the A section. In 1979, Brown informed us that he was the original Disco Man. Fair enough. The first single off this album, Too Funky in Here, is indeed very funky. This is the first time that James has recorded with studio musicians where it has resulted in a truly great groove. Want to know why? Because that band is one of America's greatest backing bands of the late 60s and 70s, the Muscle Shoals rhythm section. The Swampers. The lineup featured two guitarists, Larry Byrom and Jimmy Jonhson, both tremendously accomplished session guitarists, but not of the usual super smooth, super slick New York City ilk. These lads were from down south. Jimmy Ray Jonhson, born February 4, 1943, was a core member along with drummer Roger Hawkins, bassist David Hood and keyboardist Barry Beckett. And it was pretty much that original Swampers lineup that played on at least 5 of the 7 Disco Man tracks. Now, Jimmy Jonhson recorded with everyone. Wilson Pickett, Aretha Franklin, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Rod Stewart, Paul Simon, Clapton, Bob Seger, Boz Scaggs. He even engineered 3 tracks on Sticky Fingers. He was this guy,
Mustang Sally,
and this guy. That's cool. Jimmy Jonhson left us on September 5th, 2019 at the age of 76. The other guitarist on Too Funky in Here is Larry Clifton Byrom, who was born in Huntsville, Alabama on December 27, 1948. He grew up in South Bend, Indiana, where he began playing guitar at age 14, dropping out of high school to become a rock star. He played in a few bands in the late 1960s, enjoying substantial success, actually got to play with Hendrix. I jammed with him at a place called The Experience Club that was on Sunset, and the group that I was in was the house band. Jimmy came in one night, screwed up out of his mind, and got on stage with us and played, and of course I was freaking out because he's the best guitar player in the world to me. In 1969, at the age of 20, Larry joined the mighty Steppenwolf and played on 3 of their albums, Monster, 7 and Steppenwolf Live. A couple of years later, Larry formed his own band Rachel, and then after another couple of years he moved back home to Alabama, where he spent the late 70s playing sessions at Muscle Shoals, including playing lead guitar on the lead single off the original Disco Man. The following year, Larry moved to Nashville and continued his session career, playing on hundreds of huge albums by hundreds of huge artists. Now, I'm not going to do the whole list thing this time. It is an insane list of A-grade country stars, but here are some quick standouts for me. He played on this massive number 1. He played the slide guitar solo on this. He wailed on this. He even played on some albums by some Aussie greats. And he played on this album, which I've always loved.
Sometimes I wonder.
Oh, and he accompanied Bo Duke a couple of times. Larry also toured with Neil Young, Peter Frampton and Steve Winwood. In fact, listen to the live recording of Another Deal Goes Down with Steve Winwood to hear Larry unleashing some searing slide guitar. He's unreal. Larry Byrom still lives in Alabama and still gigs occasionally. Larry only played on that one James Brown song, but he and Jimmy Jonhson really laid it down. Let's have a look at their parts. In 1980, James released another Muscle Shoals product, People. Similar but not as strong an album as its predecessor. The opening track, Regret, is a total departure from both funk and disco. Written by Barbara Wyrick for Marie Osmond, who rejected it. Regret sounds like regret. It sounds like a Marie Osmond reject. But I mention it because it features Troy Seals on guitar, who we met back in Chapter 1 when he contributed to a couple of James Brown's albums in the late 60s. There's not that much else to talk about on this album. Let the Funk Flow was penned by the same guys who wrote Old Time Rock and Roll, but you'd never know it. Jimmy Jonhson and Troy Seals are the only guitar players that I can find associated with this album, but the guitar's just not really at the forefront on this one. Later in 1980, Brown returned to his home state, Georgia, to record material that would end up on Soul Syndrome and Non-Stop. These sessions saw both the return of Jimmy Nolen and the debut of Ronald Rock Laster. There's not that much of interest on Non-Stop, but Funky Men and Smokin Drinkin from Soul Syndrome are both worth a listen. Smokin Drinkin in particular is an amazing example of interwoven guitar perfection. The album Closer is a rehash of live staple Honky Tonk, the song that secured little Bobby Roach's place as one of James Brown's most important guitarists. This version features a couple of tasty solos by Jimmy Nolen, which is great, but hang on, who is Ronald Rock Laster? Well, fortunately for you, I've listened to Rick Flynn's 2.5-hour podcast with Ron. Rick Flynn is insufferable to listen to, so you can thank me for subjecting myself to that as he talked about himself rather than listening to Ron. But here's what I learned. Ron was born in Feb 54 with 6 fingers on each hand. He was raised in Niagara Falls, New York, and taught himself to play guitar by listening to Sly and the Family Stone and Kool the Gang. The interview did feature an interesting discussion around the origins of the chicken scratching funk guitar. Ron's opinions on who pioneered this crucial funk playing style included his JB partner, Jimmy Nolen, of course, but he also credits Freddie Stone from Sly's band and a name I was far less familiar with, Clade's Charles Smith from Kool the Gang. And listen to this. The first notes we ever heard from Kool the Gang, the eponymous title track of their December 69 debut. Now, I noted both Jimmy Nolen and his almost entirely unknown predecessor, Wally Richardson, scratching out some funk strumming back in '68, so I'm not sure who actually got it from who. So the story of Ron joining James Brown is that Ron's girlfriend heard that Keith Gregory had left and James was in desperate need of a second guitarist to play alongside Jimmy Nolen. The band were in Buffalo. Ron drove over from Niagara Falls, went upstairs at the hotel expecting to meet Mr. Brown, but was instead greeted by Jimmy, Danny Ray and the rest of the band sitting around playing cards. So Jimmy picks up his guitar and says, "Can you play this?" Ron, who's learnt by ear, easily mimics what Jimmy Nolen plays. Jimmy says, "All right, can you do this?" Ron copies him. Jimmy Nolen looks at him and says, "Can you play Tonk?" Ron says, "Yeah." So Jimmy says, "All right, put your guitar down and pull up a seat." So he's in the band. He's met the dual criteria that everybody wants. He can play his instrument and he can fit in. In a now familiar scenario, Ron wasn't introduced to the boss, wasn't given a rehearsal or even a set list. He was just simply told to be at sound check. As it turns out, James gave Ronald Rock Laster his nickname on that very first night on stage in what Ron claims was Studio 54, although James didn't play at Studio 54 until March 1980 as far as what I can find. Anyway, Ron's playing was always a little grittier, a tad more overdriven than his forebears. During the show, James is introducing the band. He peers into the darkness at this mysterious new guitarist, realises he doesn't know his name, and announces him as Daddy Rock, which stuck. Daddy Rock. Ronald Rock Laster. Ron remained in James's band off and on. He claims he was fired at least 22 times, right up until the very end in 2006. On paper, Ron was all set to be James's final guitarist. Bags packed, ride arranged, ticket in hand, ready to depart for a post-Christmas tour in 2006, when Charlie Bobbitt called and told Ron that James had passed away. Rock Laster also has an obscure Aussie connection. He and Tony Cook played on Cold Chisel keyboard player and songwriter Don Walker's 1999 solo effort, Ruby, with his band Catfish. Rock Laster was hugely important to James throughout the 80s, as a quick look through live clips on YouTube will reveal. After the sad loss of Jimmy Nolen and many of James's long-term staples, Ron quickly became his MD and even his hype man. Usually seen playing a PVT 60, Ron's overdriven solos were balanced perfectly with his ever funkier chordal chops. Check out his groove on It's Too Funky in Here from Japan in 1986, or Sex Machine from Italy in January 1988. Ron's right hand gradually grew into a clockwork funk machine. James Brown parted ways with Polydor in 1981 and didn't record for a couple of years. And when he did in 1983, it was a pretty weak result. Bring It On's 6 tracks feature 3 very out-of-date covers and a James Brown organ jam, leaving only the title track and a recycled decade-old recording as the only 2 cuts worth listening to. At least James finally deigned to grace the cover with some brief credits. I've had the pleasure of recording this album with Jimmy Nolen, misspelled, Arthur Dixon and JB's Internationals. Those scant liner notes obscure the fact that the album's funkiest cut, You Can't Keep a Good Man Down, was actually recorded back in '71 during a session featuring Cheese Martin and Robert Lee Coleman, the same session that produced the great JB's track Gimme Some More. Most cuts on Bring It On feature 2 guitars, and I'm confident Ron Laster is back playing alongside Jimmy Nolen on what would be Chank's final studio performances. Later that year, on December 18, 1983, Jimmy Nolen died from a heart attack whilst on tour in Atlanta, Georgia. He was 49. He'd been quietly defining the James Brown sound since playing on Papa's Got a Brand New Bag back in 1965. What will Mr. Brown do? The final chapter is close.